Hi everyone! For my final project, I decided to focus on something called the Innocence Project. Throughout this course, we spend a lot of time talking about things like race, the carceral state, policing, punishment, and rehabilitation. But while thinking about all those topics, I kept coming back to one question that I honestly didn't think we've talked about enough. Can a justice system be truly just if it can't admit its wrongdoings? This is exactly why I chose the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project is a nonprofit legal organization founded in 1992, and their mission has been to exonerate people who have been wrongfully convicted through DNA testing, while also working to reform the criminal justice system so these mistakes happen less often in the future. What really surprised me while looking into all of this is that these organizations are not simply just trying to free innocent people one case at a time. They're also trying to understand why these wrongful convictions happen in the first place. According to the Innocence Project, the leading causes include many things such as eyewitness misidentification, false confessions, unreliable forensic science, etc. Looking at that list, it became obvious to me that wrongful convictions are usually not just caused by one bad decision. They often result from multiple failures happening throughout the legal process. I think this organization connects really well with what we'll learn throughout the class. One of the biggest themes in Howard's book was that the American carceral state is exceptionally cruel. Howard spends a lot of time showing how the US incarcerates people at rates far higher than comparable democracies, and how punishment extends long after someone leaves the prison. The Innocence Project just adds another layer to this discussion. Howard mainly asks us to think about the consequences of incarceration. The Innocence Project asks us to think about something that comes even earlier. What if people should never have been incarcerated in the first place? That completely changes how I think about justice. It's one thing to debate whether prison sentences are too harsh. It's another thing entirely to realize that some people entering prisons are actually innocent. Throughout this course, we've also discussed Michelle Alexander's argument in The New Jim Crow. Alexander argues that mass incarceration functions as a modern racial caste system that disproportionately harms Black Americans. The Innocence Project doesn't argue exactly the same thing, but I think their work strongly supports many of Alexander's concerns. Black Americans are disproportionately represented among people who have later been exonerated through DNA evidence. That does not automatically prove every conviction was motivated by racism, but it does raise difficult questions about bias throughout policing, investigations, eyewitnesses, identification, prosecutions, and sentencing. Earlier in the semester, we also read a piece by Gilliam and Iyinger's article about race and crime. One idea that really stayed with me was their discussion of the crime script. They argue that local news often represents crime in a predictable narrative, where viewers receive limited information and begin relying on visual cues like race or ethnicity when imaging suspects. When I first read that article, I thought mostly about public perception. Now I think it also connects directly to wrongful convictions. If society unconsciously associates crime with certain racial groups, then those assumptions do not simply stay inside TV screens. They can influence eyewitnesses, juries, police investigations, and ultimately the legal outcomes. And another thing that really connects this organization to our course is the idea that punishment affects much more than the defendant. Throughout this semester, we've talked about how incarceration impacts families, neighborhoods, and entire communities. The Innocence Project reminds us that wrongful convictions do exactly the same thing. When an innocent person spends 20 or 30 years in prison, they lose birthdays, graduation, relationships, careers, and time with their families that they never get back. Their families, they lose a lot, like parents, spouses, siblings, and children, even after someone is released. Many continue struggling to rebuild their lives. Something I found especially interesting, and something we really didn't spend much time discussing in class, I guess, is the role of science. DNA testing has completely transformed criminal justice over the last few decades. Before researching this project, I honestly didn't realize how many convictions from the 1980s and 1990s have been overturned because of the advances in forensic technology. That made me realize that justice isn't just some statistic. As science changes, our understanding of truth also changes. I think that's a really hopeful idea because it means legal systems are capable of correcting mistakes, even if those corrections sometimes come a bit too late. At the same time, DNA evidence cannot solve every wrongful conviction. Many cases have no biological evidence left to test. Others includes crimes where DNA was never collected. This means organizations like the Innocence Project are incredibly important, but they also remind us that many innocent people may never receive the same opportunities for exoneration. Finally, the assignment asks whether I'd support this organization. For me, the answer is definitely yes, and I'm giving a more personal reason too. Last summer, I turned at an immigration law firm, and although immigration law is obviously kind of different from criminal law, I somehow over I saw how overwhelming legal systems can feel for ordinary people. Many clients struggled simply because they didn't understand the process or faced language barriers. Watching attorneys advocate for people during that internship made me appreciate how important legal advocacy really is. The Innocence Project represents that same idea. Instead of assuming institutions are always correct, they recognize that justice sometimes requires questioning those institutions. Throughout this class, I found myself thinking less about politics as competing ideologies and more about human dignity. Whether we read Howard, Michelle Alexander, or discussing Rikers Island, I kept coming back to the idea that policies are never abstract because they always affect real people. I think the Innocence Project embodies that lesson. It reminds us that behind every statistic is an actual human being. And at the end of the day, I don't think supporting the Innocence Project is simply about supporting criminal justice reform. It's about believing that truth matters, a justice system will never be perfect, and human beings make mistakes, police officers make mistakes, witnesses make mistakes, and judges also make mistakes. But I think a truly just system is one that is willing to recognize those mistakes and work to correct them instead of pretending they never happened. To me, that's what the Innocence Project represents. Thank you.